Okay, so let's try and get our heads around this whole situation with the electronics tariffs. It's been moving fast.
Yeah, definitely a bit of whiplash for the markets.
It kicked off with an announcement from the White House suggesting smartphones, computers, they'd be exempt from new tariffs.
Right. And that immediately got people thinking, okay, maybe things are cooling down with China since they export so much of this stuff.
Exactly. And the market, well, it reacted fast. Apple's stock surged. And the main U.S. stock indexes, they all finished higher that Monday. Tech stocks globally seemed to get a lift, too.
It showed just how much everyone was hoping for some good news on the trade front, especially for consumer tech.
The Customs and Border Protection seemed to clarify things. They said, yes, smartphones, laptops exempt from most China tariffs, and that baseline 10% tariff, too.
So initial sigh of relief, right?
Yeah.
Seemed pretty clear-cut for a moment there.
For a moment, yeah. But then over the weekend, President Trump himself kind of stepped in.
And contradicted it.
Right. Said these products weren't an exception. They were just moved to a different box.
A different box.
Yeah.
Which is not exactly clarifying, is it?
No. It just threw a whole lot of uncertainty back into the mix. What does different box even mean?
Exactly. Are they exempt or just under some other rule we don't know about yet? It left everyone guessing.
And he also said he'd reveal the tariff rate on imported semiconductors, like the next week. Another layer.
Yeah. And focusing on semiconductors really signals where their strategic thinking might be heading. That's a critical area.
And he mentioned this ongoing national security tariff investigation, too, covering the whole electronics supply chain.
Right, which suggests it's not just about trade balance numbers. It's looking at, security where things are made, resilience.
Then Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick tried to clear it up, I guess. He said the exemption was just temporary, a deferral.
A deferral, not a removal. That's a really key difference.
Huge difference.
And Lutnick said electronics would, quote, likely be included in specific semiconductor tariffs coming within a month or two.
So the relief, if there was any, was potentially very short-lived.
Seems that way.
Yeah.
And it brings semiconductors back into focus as the main target, perhaps.
And these new tariffs, whenever they arrive, they'd be on top of those global tariffs the U.S. put in place back in April, the ones they suspended for 90 days.
Correct. It's getting complicated. A lot of moving parts, different tariff buckets.
Yeah, hard to track. Lutnick also really pushed the idea of making pharmaceuticals, semiconductors, electronics here in America.
Well, that definitely points to the bigger goal, doesn't it? Trying to get companies to bring production back stateside. Economic reasons, maybe security reasons, too.
And Trump clarified something else, too, that 20% import tax on electronics linked to fentanyl trafficking from China, that's totally separate, not part of this exemption talk.
Right, so keeping different policy tracks distinct, although they can interact, of course.
He also floated the idea of short-term exemptions for car makers if they shift parts sourcing to Canada and Mexico.
Which could tie into the USMCA, the new North American trade deal, shows some flexibility, maybe in certain areas based on other trade goals.
Okay, so that's the U.S. side. How did China take all this? First, the good news, then the confusion.
Well, initially, China's Commerce Ministry sort of welcomed the partial break on consumer electronics.
Makes sense. They sell a lot of those to the U.S.
Absolutely. Any hint of fewer tariffs there would be seen positively, even if it's small.
But they didn't just leave it at that, did they?
No, they kept pushing their main point, urging the U.S. to cancel all the tariffs, get back to mutual respect. That's been their line all along.
Consistent message.
Very. They see these tariffs as harmful, period, to everyone.
President Xi Jinping even said in an editorial pretty bluntly that there are no winners in a trade war.
Yeah, a direct statement of their position.
And he talked about needing both countries to protect the multilateral trading system, stable supply chains, an open global environment.
Which, contrasts a bit with the unilateral tariff approach the U.S. has been taking, at least in their public statements.
China's Commerce Ministry called the U.S. exemption idea just a small step, said they were still assessing it.
Sounds cautious, right? It's like, okay, we see this, but given the back and forth and the temporary nature, we're not getting too excited.
Understandable. And you have to remember the background here. This has been going on for a while, escalating tariffs back and forth.
Oh, yeah. The Trump administration put on some pretty hefty taxes, up to 145% on some Chinese goods since taking office.
And China hit back. Their retaliatory tariffs are currently around 125% on U.S. stuff. It's been tough for businesses on both sides.
Definitely. And China even hinted they could restrict exports of rare earth elements.
Which would be huge. They're vital for, computer chips, EV batteries, high-tech everything.
That's a major leverage point for them, given how much of the supply they control. A serious threat.
And they said they'd fight to the end if the U.S. kept provoking a trade war. Strong words.
Very strong. Shows how high the stakes are.
So, back to the markets. We said they initially jumped on the exemption news Monday.
Yeah, that first reaction was positive.
But then then after Trump's comments, things got choppy.
Very volatile day.
Like, yeah.
Indexes opened high, then sort of fizzled, gave back some gains.
Even though they closed higher in the end, that ride during the day tells a story, doesn't it?
It really highlights the uncertainty. Investors just don't know what to make of these mixed signals. Is policy shifting or not?
And the feeling is any relief might just be temporary anyway, which makes long-term planning
Almost impossible. For businesses, for investors, how can you plan when the rules might change next week?
The VIX, Wall Street's fear gauge, it came down a bit from its recent highs, but it didn't exactly collapse.
No, it suggests there's still quite a bit of anxiety lingering in the market. That uncertainty is still priced in to some extent.
Analysts are really pointing to this lack of clarity, saying it hampers businesses, investors, even consumers from making long-term spending plans. Jed Ellerbrook at Argent Capital Advisors said basically that.
It makes sense. If you're a business, do you build that new factory? Hire more people? If you're a consumer, do you buy that big-ticket item? The uncertainty makes you pause.
And you hear it from the top, too. Goldman Sachs CEO David Solomon called it a distinctly different operating environment, said he sees more signs of slowing activity, rising recession odds.
That's a pretty sober assessment from a major player.
And Ray Dalio, the billionaire investor, was even blunter, said the tariffs are pushing the U.S. closer to recession or maybe something worse.
Wow. Yeah, these are serious warnings about the potential economic fallout.
We also saw Citi cut their year-end target for the S&P 500. And not alone, other big firms are lowering forecasts for earnings, for growth, blaming the tariff uncertainty.
Yeah, the expected hit to corporate profits and the wider economy is starting to show up in those forecasts.
And it's trickling down, maybe. New York Fed surveys show consumers are getting more pessimistic about the short term and worried about inflation picking up.
That inflation piece is key. Tariffs often mean higher prices for imported goods, and that hits consumers directly in the wallet.
So even though Apple's stock got that initial bump, the underlying worries about their supply chains, which are global, and potential price hikes for consumers, those haven't gone away.
No, a short-term stock move doesn't solve those fundamental challenges, especially for companies so reliant on complex global supply chains.
There was some advice from Dipanjan Chatterjee at Forrester basically saying companies should just keep diversifying their supply chains anyway, like don't stop now, and have backup pricing plans ready.
Seems like smart risk management in this climate. Build resilience, have options.
Speaking of prices, interesting move from Sony. They raised the PlayStation 5 price by about 10% in places like Europe, Australia, New Zealand.
Oh, really?
Yeah, citing the challenging economic environment, inflation, currency swings, but not in the U.S.
That shows how complex it is. Global pressures hitting different regions differently. Maybe the U.S. market dynamics are distinct, or they made a different calculation there.
Meanwhile, the White House line remains consistent, right? Tariffs are a tool for negotiation, for better deals, for bringing jobs back.
That's the official rationale, yes. That the short-term pain, if any, is worth the long-term gain in trade balances and domestic manufacturing.
But the evidence on whether that works is debated.
It's very much debated. The immediate effects we have seen are market volatility and widespread concern about global trade slowing down.
Yeah, you can't deny the market reactions and the anxiety.
Whether the intended long-term benefits materialize, that's still an open question.
Some analysts, like at UBS, thought maybe the tech stock rally could hang on for a bit because of that 90-day pause on some tariffs and this electronics deferral.
A temporary window, perhaps. A pause in the escalation might offer some breathing room.
But Morgan Stanley quickly chimed in, deferral isn't removal.
Crucial point.
And the longer this uncertainty drags on, the more it could hurt business spending, hiring down the road.
Exactly. Uncertainty itself is a drag on the economy. Businesses hate uncertainty when making big decisions.
And just to cap it off, the U.S. Trade Representative Jameson Greer said on Sunday, no plans currently for Trump to meet Xi Jinping.
Which suggests, well, don't hold your breath for a quick resolution at the highest level.
Right. So this uncertainty looks like it might be sticking around for a while.
It certainly seems that way. It's a complex web, and we're still watching how it unfolds.
Definitely leaves us with a lot to think about regarding global trade and how it impacts pretty much everything. Thanks for walking through all the twists and turns with me.
My pleasure. Always good to talk it through.
And thank you for tuning in as we try to make sense of this unfolding story. If you found this discussion useful, please do hit like and subscribe. It helps others find us, and you won't miss our future analyses. We'll be back soon. Until then, take care.